Hello. Can I see Nadia? Hold on a second. How is everyone on this Saturday? Okay, what's going on? I accepted it. Ah, there she is.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you
How
hear
are
me
you?
okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you
Oh,
hear me
great.
okay? I don't know
Yeah.
what's wrong with my phone. Okay. It's like I'm like crooked. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Everyone here okay? Okay, hopefully. I don't know what's going on with my phone. So nice to finally meet you
Yes, thank you so much.
and to talk to you about, you know what, I was thinking, what would be, this is such a great way to end our year. This book is absolutely, it's heartbreaking, but it's so beautifully written.
Thank you so much. That's so nice.
And you're welcome. And everyone that when I was telling them that, I announced that I was picked, so many great comments like, oh my God, that's such a great book. You guys picked a great book. So I'm super, super excited that we closed out with this book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's really fun to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna jump in. I'm gonna do a little bit announcement and just hop right in. I don't know why my phone. Am I showing up dark to you?
No, you look good on my
Okay,
end.
because for me it's like looking kind of dark, so I don't know, but I just want to make sure that everyone can see and that they can hear us. Welcome to our book chat day. This is our last book chat for 2021. So it'll be good to have a break, but we are ending on a wonderful note. I'm Jamise. I'm the founder of Diverse Spines, and our November spine of the month was Aftershocks by Nadia Owusu. I said your last name right? Owusu.
Yes.
Yes. It's a wonderful, wonderful memoir, but I also want to say like it's a history lesson. It's so much. And I cried quite a bit during this. I'll tell you about the parts when I cried, but I want to welcome you. And if you have any questions for Nadia, please put them in the questions box down below. But it also pinned a link. If you want to support our bookshop, the book is in our bookshop. It's Aftershocks. This is the paperback edition. There's also a hardcover that has this gorgeous photo on it. I love, 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 love that. So how are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah. I'm adjusting to the cold weather and the fact that it's getting dark early now, but
That's really hard for me too. I mean, that's
yeah.
super hard for me. It's to the 4:30, 5 o'clock when it's getting like dark.
Yeah, and it happens every year, but every year it startles me. So
It's super, super hard. So I rather than give a bio, I'm going to let you tell folks about yourself. But I want to start with on page 33 of the paperback. You say this: it's always been difficult for me to say the word home without any conviction. And I found that very interesting, specifically because of your section where you talk about the, hold on, I have it right here, the resettlement registration form.
mm-hmm.
And I want you to just tell us, about yourself and then talk about this whole origin, because I mean, you have so much history in your DNA, literally.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think all of us do in so many ways. And
Yes.
it's interesting how, we walk through life and oftentimes don't think about the fact that we're carrying so many histories with us and the importance of kind of trying to make sense of those histories and coming to understand them, because of course they're impacting us whether we realize it or not. And I think that was sort of one of the big missions of the book, was coming to understand some of those histories. But I think connecting to the question that you asked and sharing a little bit about my background. So I was born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and that's because my father, who worked for the United Nations World Food Program, was stationed there at the time of my birth. But my father was actually from the Ashanti tribe in Ghana. in West Africa. And my mother is Armenian American from Massachusetts. And her family came to the United States from what was then the Ottoman Empire, and escaping a genocide. And my parents actually met in Massachusetts when my father came to America for university. And often, you know, people will, when I tell people about my parentage, people will often ask, like, how did that even happen? So
Right.
that's how that happened. My father was studying in Massachusetts. My mother grew up there. And they moved to Tanzania, where I was born. And, you know, 2 years after I was born and my sister Yasmin was born, my parents separated, and well, my mother left, and my father had custody of my sister and I. But we grew up, because of his job, moving around to a different country every couple of years. And so we lived, and I went to school in Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Italy, went to boarding school in England for a little while. And so, you know, my whole life I was so lucky in so many ways. I got to see so much of the world and experience all of these rich cultures. My father actually eventually remarried a woman from Tanzania. So I have a half Ghanaian, half Tanzanian brother. And my mother married a man from Somalia. And so I also have half Somali, half Armenian siblings. And,
Wow.
you know, it's wonderful to come from such an international background, but at the same time, and moving around so much, but at the same time, I often struggled to find kind of steady ground in my own sense of self, even, and trying to understand who I was in the world. And, you know, depending on where I was in the world, people would interpret me differently or have different sets of expectations for me. And I found myself, especially when I was younger, kind of trying to pretzel myself to fit those expectations. And so I think as an adult, part of the challenge, which kind of I approached through the writing of this book, was how do I figure out how to answer that question, where are you from a very honest place that is true to all of the cultures that I belong to, but also how do I reconnect to a sense of roots as someone who, you know, has often been described or seen as rootless. And so that was sort of one of the big missions of writing the book.
I mean, I think you did it so well. I mean, it's just like there's one part. I listened to the audio, which you narrate, which is really nice as well. But you talk about the, you know, the whole question of where you're from. And when you go through it, you say at the end, confused, me too. I never know how to answer the question of my origin.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so rich, and it's just, oh my goodness. So can you tell us what inspired you to write this memoir? And I think I also want to know, like, what inspired you to write it? And then when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, so the second part of your question is really easy to answer, because I actually don't remember a time before I wanted to be a writer in some way. When I was a kid, when I was really young, I think that my aspirations were I wanted to be a human rights lawyer, just because that was sort of the world that I grew up in terms of the work that my father did. I wanted to be a writer, and I was really clear about that. And I you know, I can remember being sort of 5 years old and writing these little novels that I would write on kind of blank paper and staple together and give to my father, who was my editor, and he would give me feedback on them. And then I wanted to be Tina Turner. Those were the three, my three aspirations. So one out of three is not terrible. But I can't recall a time before wanting to be a writer. But I think as I got older, sort of the idea of being an artist and, you know, how one survives as an artist became very daunting. And I wasn't certain that it was in the cards for me. And so I went into a career working in nonprofits. I studied urban policy and planning in university, but always wrote, you know, mostly for myself. And one of the big projects that I was working on, coming to the other part of your question, in terms of what inspired me to write this particular book, I think for much of my 20s, I was coming in and out of periods of deep depression. My father died when I was 14, and I had never really fully grieved that loss. He was the great hero of my life, and I really struggled to allow myself to fully feel the grief of losing him at such a young age. And because my life was somewhat unstable after he passed away as well, because my mother had left when I was so young and was still not prepared to be a parent. And so I lived with my stepmother for a while, and sort of struggled, moving to United States for university kind of on my own, not really being connected to family here. And so, I was struggling with mental health issues, anxiety and depression. And I had this really strong sense that I think actually was a gift that my father gave me, that one of the ways that I could find my way out of that depression was to come to more deeply understand who I am, and connect to the stories of my ancestors. And, he always emphasized the need, particularly, we often in the schools that I went to, international schools or growing up in Europe, African history was largely left out of my history books, even when we were in Africa. And so he made it his project to sort of ensure that I understood and was curious and sort of rooted in a sense of African history and Black diasporic history. And he had a very Pan-African worldview. And so that was always something that I, felt connected to and felt proud of, even as I was sort of grappling with who I was and where I was from. And so I had this sense that one of the ways, again, to find my way out of that deep depression was to reconnect to those stories, reconnect to those histories, to come to understand them in a way that I never had before, and including the histories of the Armenian side of my family, which I was largely disconnected from growing up. And so that was also a history that I didn't deeply know. And so I started writing the book as a private project, really for myself, to sort of to kind of do the work that I felt like I needed to do to come back to a sense of who I was. And I had various other projects that I was working on, over those years. Much of my 20s and 30s, I was sort of dipping in and out of this manuscript. And then eventually, as I was approaching 30, I realized that the one thing that I would regret, if I didn't at least try, was sort of that dream of being a writer. And so I had accumulated all of these pages just for myself. And then the question became, can I make art out of this that others would want to read? And so then that was the next challenge.
And that's my next question, so for the, having this conversation ongoing about the, diversity in publishing. And so how was your publishing journey? Was it a situation, because, people always hear that, no one wants to hear their story, or people, so how was your publishing journey?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think I'm so grateful that I started writing this book really for myself.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and I didn't have aspirations necessarily for this project as being a book. I wasn't thinking about it as a book. I was genuinely following my own curiosities and questions, and desire to kind of come to terms and reckon with the issues that are at the center of my life, including sort of how do you process grief and trauma, intergenerational trauma, how do you come to understand the history that you carry in your body and how it works in your life. And so I think because I had all of that time to really just work on it for myself and approach it from that kind of level of honesty, that meant that when I did decide that I was interested in potentially seeing if I could turn it into a book that others would read, that I had a really strong commitment to the truth that was at the center of the book and a clear vision for what I wanted it to do and be in the world. And I think because I was a little bit older too, I was in my mid-30s by the time, I was ready to kind of even think about publishing. That sense of sort of commitment and clarity around sort of what the non-negotiables were kind of guided how I approached my publishing journey. And so I was really clear that I wanted to work with people who understood what I was trying to do with this book and wanted to make it the best version of itself, not to turn it into something else, And I did, hear from a lot of people early on that like, it's not linear enough, that there are too many stories going on, that it's difficult to follow because of the different cultures and countries. But for so many of us, it's impossible to write about our lives without connecting to those stories. And so, but I wasn't fazed by that because I had that sense of clarity and vision and all of that time spent sort of getting getting really close to the issues at the heart of the story and what really mattered. And so, you know, I took my time to find people who understood that project, and then was really lucky to find those folks. And with my agent, she, from the very start, was really supportive of what this book wanted to be and not trying to make it something else. And I think that's so important as artists, that you want to find people. It's not to say that we want to be rigid about
Right.
our work or precious about our work, but sort of what's at the heart of what we're doing, and wanting to sort of maintain that even as you go into sort of the capitalist side of art making is really important, I think.
I think that's the one thing that I love the most, is that it's not linear, and that it has so much, it's so rich. There's so many layers to just your story. And so how does your, we're going to dive into it, but I'm not going to give anything away, because I think people should read it. For those of you just joining, I forgot to put the title of what we're doing, but this is our book chat. Our November spine of the month was Aftershocks. We're talking with the author Nadia. How does your family feel about this? And back to your publishing journey really quick, but I love the fact that it was for yourself. It was for you at first. So therefore, whatever came after is kind of like a bonus. It really is. So how does your family feel about the memoir?
Yeah, I've been really lucky, and on so many levels. One of the things that I'll say is, because I was approaching this as a book that I was writing for myself, part of that was coming to a reconnection and reconciliation with my mother, for example, with whom
Right.
I had been estranged for over a decade. And in connecting to sort of the history of her family and how they came to America, and sort of the trauma that they carried, but then also sort of the joyful parts of that culture that I had experienced as a child and then lost, and realizing that I was grieving that loss too, and that there were ways that I could kind of seek to repair and reach out, if she was willing, and if her family were open to it. And so part of the writing too was kind of drove me to that, which meant that I was having really honest conversations with people in my life, as I was sort of working on this, what was then not a book, but was really sort of like a reckoning, for myself. And so then, because, I spent all of those years in conversation with the people in my life, nothing that was in the book ultimately was a surprise,
Right.
to them, because we had been in dialogue about it, and actually we're having much more honest conversations than I think we would have otherwise, because as the questions were coming up for me, I was asking people, do you remember things this way? Do you remember them differently? Like, what was the story? What were some of the choices that you were wrestling with at that time? And so I'm very lucky that my family has been very, very supportive, of the book.
And so the one part that I struggled with was your dad, because he looms very large. He's the anchor to, and in your life, you get that sense of how important he was, the love, and I just love how you showed family, dispelling, the traditionals of the Western world. And my dad was very large in my life as well. And I felt your pain. I lost my dad 8 years ago, but I lost him at 45 years old, versus your age. I think you said you were 14.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you're talking about him, and you're talking about the lessons that you learned that still, carry you through to today, I was like in tears. And I just want you to talk a little bit about, that relationship, as much as you want to. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I'm sorry for your loss as well.
Yeah.
And I think for all of us who have lost parents, with whom we were, really close. And I think my relationship with my father, sometimes people will ask me sort of how have you managed to kind of go through so many of the things that you've been through? And I'll always say that the root of that love has carried me through everything in my life. And that the lessons that he taught me have sustained me, and that I can continue to come back to them throughout my life to kind of look for guidance and to find a way forward in the world. And I feel so lucky to have had that relationship for as long as I did. As much as, you know, it is really sad, and I think I will grieve for the rest of my life, you know, which I think is also something that I needed to come to terms with in the writing of the book. But, you know, my father was my home in so many ways. He was my steady ground. He was the person who was always there for me. And so it was very difficult to lose him at such a young age. But one of the things that I sort of learned as I was writing the book was just being reminded of, you know, all of the ways that he sought to prepare me for the world. You know, he couldn't have possibly known, you know, he died when he was very young. He wasn't 40 yet. He was only 39 when he died. And so he couldn't have possibly known how much I would need those lessons, especially after he was gone. But that, I mean, anyone who knows him knows that that's just sort of who he was in the world. He was endlessly curious, always looking to understand more deeply, always looking to connect more deeply. And, you know, from just examples of like when we lived in different countries, he always wanted to make sure that we understood the history of that place and that we connected with the culture and celebrated the culture, to sort of introducing me to sort of the music and the literature that he loved, and making sure that, you know, that I followed my passions and interests and never stopped asking questions. Like all of those things, I think, really shaped my worldview and shaped who I am as a person. And one of the beautiful things of writing the book too was that, you know, I think when you try to run away from grief, which so many of us do, and when you try to power through it, you end up sort of losing touch with the joy, which is on the other side of the grief, right?
Yeah.
You lose touch with the joy and with the love. And so I think as difficult as writing some of those passages were, it was also really wonderful to be able to reconnect to those stories that were so meaningful in my life.
Yeah, I saw an interview, I can't remember where, but I don't know if you remember, you were speaking about, and I felt this because I've said this before, it's like because of your relationship with your dad and the love, you know, after their passing, you were able to, you know, love again or laugh again. And it's all because of what they've instilled in you, you know, and I just, everything that you were saying, I felt it so deeply. And it's the way that you write your prose is so beautiful for something so heartbreaking.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That means a lot to me.
Now, can we talk about, you talked about your dad, you guys living in different places, but the, you know, uprooting versus belonging. In every chapter, you start like with the memory, so to speak. But when you give us a history lesson, like you connect the trauma or the grief or whatever's going on where you're living or where you are, you connect that to the story. And can you talk a little bit about that? I love the way you did that.
Thank you so much. Yes, you know, I think it was really important to me from the very beginning that this was going to be kind of a genre fluid book that was going to, yes, explore and dig into the stories of my life, but that was also going to connect those stories to the stories of my ancestors and to the stories of the places where they came from. And that ultimately, like, we cannot be disconnected from those stories, and that in fact not realizing those connections and not making those connections is actually is why we can't heal and move forward in our lives. And so you know, I think especially coming from histories that have so often been mistreated, you know, if you do study African history, for example, as a child, or at least this was the case when I was growing up. And I know, like, especially sort of seeing what's going on in this country now about sort of people trying to ban books about slavery and not teaching that history in schools, or the genocide of Native Americans, and kind of removing those stories from history books or watering them down. That's so harmful. And I think, you know, growing up and not having access to the histories of the places where my family came from, or if you did get any African history, usually it was sort of restricted to ancient Egypt and was often sort of taught in a very strange way where they would sort of make it seem as though Egypt was in the middle of Europe and not in Africa. Or it was sort of colonial history. But in terms of pre-colonial history or the independence movements in Africa, the sort of richness of the continent, you know, Africa was sort of reduced to like a single story in so many ways. And that does such harm, you know, to those of us who come from those really beautiful, rich places that have contributed so much to the world. And so for me, connecting and grounding my story in those histories was so fundamentally important to the project of what I was trying to do. It also helped me to feel more connected to my family, you know, and to my father and to his parents, and, you know, to the places that they came from, which, you know, I didn't grow up in Ghana. And right. So that was also a way for me to come to more deeply understand, you know, my history and where I came from. And similarly with the Armenian side of my family, you know, because my mother left when I was so young, I wasn't even really raised in that culture. And although I knew that, you know, it was genocide that brought my family to America, the story of that genocide is mistreated so often. You know, the United States didn't even recognize the Armenian genocide formally until this year, when Joe Biden was the first US president to recognize the genocide, despite the fact that there are many Armenians who are American, exactly because of that history. Yeah. And so, you know, when you realize how your histories have been mistreated, I think being part of a project to revise those stories so that they're more truthful and to reclaim them for yourself is an act that is so important for so many of us. And, you know, I'm speaking about my own specific histories, right. But I think it's true for, you know, so many of us who whose histories have sort of been erased or treated badly.
Specifically in these times when you, like you said, history is trying, especially in America right now, you know, trying to erase or change history. Yeah, it's, anyway.
We can talk about that.
I mean, another show, different day for that.
Yeah.
Can we talk about, you say in the book that you were mothered, or I keep thinking, because I've watched so many interviews with you, either in the book or an interview, you said you were mothered by your father as well. But let's talk about the mothers in the book. And let's talk about, you know, your relationships. Here's the thing. Your prose, like I said, is beautiful. But the thing about, you write complicated relationships, you still show people's humanity, you know, because no one is perfect. And so I want you to talk about, like, a little bit, whatever you want to share, but how you decided to tell the stories of your biological mom and your stepmom.
Yeah, you know, I think when you're a child,
and you were very honest, like at the part when you were talking about how you wanted to sit on your dad's lap, you felt like the stepmother when she first, I mean, all of that. I literally was laughing at that part. I was like, okay, yeah, she's getting it. She's telling her bratty side. She's letting us know what's going on. You were very honest and very transparent.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's so important, you know, if you're writing about other people, and if you're going to sort of, and if you're writing with the intention to move toward deeper connection and love, which I think is the best aim. You know, I think that if you're writing from a place of bitterness, or you're writing, you know, toward revenge or any other sort of like other reasons that can bring you to the page, what ends up happening is that you not only reduce other people to sort of, you know, a single story, which again, we've spoken about in terms of history, how that can be so harmful, but it's also really harmful when we're talking about people, because people are very complicated, and all of us make mistakes. And I think for me, because the aim was sort of was around reckoning and coming to terms with some of the difficult stories in my life, but also sort of reconnecting to some deeper meaning and truth that could sort of sustain me as I moved forward in my life, that required me to be really honest about those relationships and to not be satisfied with simple answers. And simple answers will often lead you to make of other people villains, which I think can be so useful. You know, it's so easy to look for somebody to blame, but it's much more difficult to sort of recognize in with our own complicity, and to tell the truth about, you know, times when we maybe have done harm to others, or
Right.
participated in doing harm.
So true.
And so it felt really necessary for me to do that, to like, if I was going to sort of hold other people accountable, that I had to hold myself equally accountable, and be as honest about the times when I fell short, and when I could have done better. And in terms of sort of writing about other people too, I think, you know, when we're kids, our parents are only, the stories of our parents, the ones that we care about, are only in the context of who they are in our story and our lives. And so pushing myself to imagine them as like full people outside of their relationships with me, and sort of their own griefs and joys and hopes and aspirations that they carried, that I think was really important work for me to push myself on.
Yeah, it was really, really good. Can you talk about, why was it important for you to talk about the big chair? And I'm gonna let you tell the audience what the big chair is about.
Yeah, so throughout the book, there are these sections that are narrated from this chair that I dragged in from the street, which I am not in the practice of doing, but there was,
Chair,
especially not in New
the
York.
blue chair.
Yeah. But there was something about this chair. I was going through a period of depression, and I think I had a sense that I was going to find myself sort of unable to leave my room for a period of time, and dragged this chair in off the street. And so those sections are really my attempts to narrate from inside of what ultimately was a breakdown or a reckoning, however we want to call it, but sort of it was a period where I felt like all of the griefs of my life were whispering and then yelling that you cannot keep avoiding us, and you cannot keep trying to power through this, and that it's really important to allow yourself to feel and to process, and therefore to heal. And so those sections are narrated from the blue chair in my room. And it was really important for me to write those sections for so many reasons. I think so many of the stories that we have about mental health crises and struggles are sort of written in retrospect. And I wanted to write from inside of the breakdown in a really embodied way, and it felt really important to do that. I also think I think this is true in so many cultures, but I think specifically for Black women, writing about mental health struggles, and especially the stereotypes that we carry in the world around, you know, being angry or being strong, that we're not allowed to feel. All of those stereotypes do so much harm. And so I thought it was really important for me to write honestly about those experiences, and hopefully to connect with other Black women who have similarly struggled.
You know what I thought about when you were going through every time you came to a section with the blue chair, I thought, you said, you know, writing while you're in it, not in retrospect, was a memoir from Basie Ikpe.
Yes.
It's the same exact, I felt that, like when she took you through her breakdown, you really felt like you were growing through it. And that book was I'm Telling the Truth, But I'm Lying.
But I'm Lying.
Yes.
It's such a brilliant book. It was the first one, you know, and I read that book. I'd already written a first draft of Aftershocks, but you know that feeling of recognition when you encounter a book and you see yourself in it. And I just was so moved by her story and the power of her words. And actually she blurbed Aftershocks very generously, and she was one of the first people on my list that I wanted to reach out to, because I was so moved and felt so connected to her.
I mean, I felt every bit of it. And I listened to her audiobook as well, and I felt that, like, I immediately came to mind when I was listening to your book, and when you were talking about that. So what surprised you the most while you were writing, either about yourself or about someone else, as you're going through all this discovery and all the history? What surprised you the most while writing the memoir?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things, you know, when I first started writing, I felt like I was writing from a place of grief, you know, and that's what I was going to sort of work through on the page. But I found that the more time that I spent working on this project, the more I realized that what I was actually doing was writing toward love. and connection. And that kept me coming back, you know, even through the difficult parts of writing the book, both in terms of the craft and like finding the right words and finding the right structure, but also in terms of kind of revisiting some of the most difficult times in my life. But what kept me returning was that all of the joy and the love that I was rediscovering and reconnecting with through writing, and sort of this sense of coming to understand the people in my life in deeper ways, which I hoped would then allow me to kind of forge different and better and stronger relationships as well.
And so can we talk about the title? Because, you know, I thought you do foreshocks. There's all these earthquake references. And so can you, throughout the book, but can you talk about how you came up with the title? And I want to know the process of coming from this cover to this cover, which I absolutely love this one.
Thank you.
So two-part question, title and then cover.
Sure. So I actually didn't have a title for a very long time because, again, I wasn't really thinking about it as a book necessarily. But I also, when I did start thinking, you know, I am going to try and write this as a book that I will hopefully be able to send out into the world, one of the things that I really struggled with was structure. And I think it's specifically because there was no way for me to write a story about a life as kind of hopscotched and sort of from so many disparate places in a linear way. And because I knew that I needed this book to be a genre fluid book that was, yes, memoir, but also a cultural history. And that was sort of at the heart of what I wanted to do with this project. But for that reason, you know, then when I realized that I did want to try and kind of send it out in the world as a book, then the question becomes sort of, but what are the anchors that can help guide people through the book? And, you know, because not everyone's going to know, you know, or have shared experiences in terms of moving around as much and coming from all of these different cultures. And I wanted it to be a book that was accessible to so many people, because I think so many of the themes, whether about family or identity, or race or grief, or longing, belonging, all of those, so many of those themes are relevant to so many people. But I felt like I needed to give people some anchors. And so then the question is, what are those anchors? And one of the structural elements we've already talked about, which is the blue chair, which is one sort of narrative element where, you know, this breakdown is narrated in a linear way over the course of 7 days and sort of split up throughout the book. So that sort of is one linear thread that carries through the book. But then the other one is the stages of an earthquake, which actually happened sort of by accident. I wrote what is now sort of the first chapter after kind of this form that's in the beginning, which is the story of an earthquake in Armenia in the 80s. That I did not experience, but I remember hearing about it on the radio, and asking my father what aftershocks were, and he told me that they're the Earth's delayed reaction to stress. And I think also because that earthquake struck Armenia, and I, you know, knew that I was half Armenian, but I was so disconnected from the Armenian side of my family. And then by chance, my mother, who I hadn't seen in several years, showed up at our house in Italy on the same day as that earthquake. And so I think in some ways that earthquake and then my own personal shaking at my mother sort of reappearing in my life, we all have those memories that kind of stick with us throughout our lives and that we feel have this deep meaning. And that's one of those memories for me. And so I wrote that chapter kind of early on, and then I think just subconsciously and by instinct started kind of weaving in some kind of seismic terms and a little bit of an earthquake metaphor throughout the book. And actually one of my friends who I sent sort of an early version, she pointed it out to me and was like, you know, you're using this earthquake metaphor. Maybe, I know you're struggling with structure. Maybe that's something that you can think about using more intentionally. And so then that's where the title Aftershocks and the Earthquake comes from.
And so about the cover, you started here.
Oh, yes.
And then this, I love this photo, and I'm just love it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so the first cover, I think we were really trying, there were so many things that I loved about it and that the designers really wanted to incorporate. So if you look very closely, you can kind of see elements in the hair and on the cloth of kind of my Ghanaian ancestry, sort of a kind of nod to kente cloth. But then also throughout the book, there are these themes of sort of, you know, walking away, like, or walking toward and walking away. And so the fact that the woman's back is turned, I think also speaks to some of the themes in the book. And so I was really excited about the way that cover sort of plays on those themes. And then the UK cover actually is more similar to the paperback cover, which is the second one, which used this photograph of me as a child and sort of gave it this treatment so that it seems like a little off kilter, and kind of speaks to the seismic themes in that way. And so then for the paperback, the American publisher wanted to do something a little bit different, and was sort of inspired by the UK cover and the use of that photo.
I love it. I absolutely love it. When you talked about, like, you know, wanting people to be able to connect with the book, specifically because you moved about for so many different places. I literally thought, like, for myself, growing up as an Army brat, my entire life, I've never lived in the same place for longer than 3 years. The first time I ever lived anywhere for longer than 3 years was when I went to college. You know?
Yeah, so there are so many, there are more of us than we realize, you know, those of us who kind of had transient lifestyles.
And I never thought about it until I read your book, and then to hear you say, you know, there are people that maybe read. I just grew up thinking that was the way of life, and you don't know that other people are literally been in one place their entire life. You know? Let's see, we have a question down here. Let's see what this says. Oh, you answered this. They said, was everyone you talked about supportive of you writing the story? And you said mostly it was for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, largely. I've been very fortunate in that way.
That's great.
Yeah.
So can you tell us what's the one thing or two or whatever that you want readers to take away from your book? Although I know you wrote it for yourself, you know, but what do you want people to take away from the book?
Well, actually, you know, the fact that I wrote it for myself, I think is connected to one of the biggest messages that I hope people take away, which is that, you know, I think in so many ways, so many of us are given stories that don't serve us, whether that's about the places where we come from, about who we are as people, about who we are as women, about our race, about our identity, about our relationships in the world, or our abilities. And I think in interrogating those stories and revising them in a way that actually serves us and inspires us and allows us to reclaim who we are, that's sort of the biggest thing that I hope that no matter what it is that you're struggling with, that you can connect with in the book.
I absolutely love that. Love, love, love. And so before we close out, I always ask, I have to know, what are you reading? Are there any recommendations?
Yes, actually, I will grab it because it's right here. I'm currently reading Monster in the Middle by Timothy, and it's amazing. I highly recommend it.
Okay, great. Okay, that's one recommendation. And then if you can share what's coming up for you next, what's on your agenda? What are you writing?
I'm working on a novel. I've been working on a novel for about a year. It's coming slowly.
Okay.
And I'm beginning to find the story, and it's really fun to kind of get in other people's minds and play around with different characters and see where they lead me.
That's awesome. Well, let me see if there's anything else in here. Oh, someone said big love from Cozy.
Oh, my cousin. Hi, Cozy.
So before, I just cannot thank you. This is like the perfect for nonfiction November or anytime. I think I'm so happy that you were agreed, you know, to come on and chat with us. Perfect book. I hope also you got picked for what, Time 100?
Yes, that was very exciting.
It's so awesome. But I can't thank you enough for coming to talk with us and for sharing your story. Happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for picking Aftershocks and sharing it with your audience. And thank you for having me. This has been really lovely.
It's been great. Hope have a wonderful holiday season.
You too.
Talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.